All right, now I turn to Section 3, Segment 2, slide set B2, on the trail of a Vietnam deception, Air Force Colonel Howard Burris, and my 1991 interviews with him. The hunt to solve the Burris-Johnson enigma. Before the door to deciphering the Viet Cong order of battle deception in Vietnam can be opened, the key to unlock a much larger problem must first be found. Howard Burris hid that key from me in an interview on 29 June 1991. It is puzzling that neither LBJ nor his advisors referred to Burris in their memoirs. LBJ's advisors, aides, and his friends, except for Burris, had all been interviewed many times for the robust Lyndon Baines Johnson Library Oral History Program. The question is why? Heather Purcell, an undergraduate history and graduate law student, University of Texas at Austin, told me in December 1993 that she believed Colonel Burris deserves an extensive oral history interview rather than a few pointed questions over the phone. When Purcell contacted Burris, Purcell asked to do an interview with him. Heather told me she had a good conversation with Burris on the phone. He agreed to do the interview that same month, in December 1993. That month came and went, and the interview never took place. So, why did Burris agree to interview me 2 years earlier, in August 1991? The answer, I now realize, is that today, like then, Burris remains a ghost of the spy wars. Flying a jet to Washington with a dead pilot in the cockpit. Burris claims that after JFK's murder in Dallas, he suddenly returned to Washington, D.C. from Texas in an Air Force jet fighter during which the pilot died. And Burris, a turboprop pilot with no jet fighter experience, calmly took over the aircraft from the back seat and flew it safely to its destination in Washington, D.C. An examination of Burris's travel records tell another story. He returned to the capital in Washington, D.C. in a tourist seat on Braniff Airlines. There was more. In the interviews with me during 1991, Howard Burris told me that his family and Lyndon Johnson's family went way back. Burris said that one day when he was on an oil rig, LBJ approached him and ordered him to get involved in the war in Europe. At the time of that interview, I had no reason to think Burris was making anything up. However, later I discovered that Burris's congressman, Richard Kleberg Sr., had much more to do with his entry into the armed forces than Lyndon Baines Johnson. Today, these dubious details leave one wondering about Burris's agenda in the past. Howard Burris, an aide or a case officer with respect to Lyndon Johnson. Burris told me that he'd been working for the CIA in Switzerland when LBJ became the vice president on 8 November 1961. Burris said he was a friend of LBJ who asked him to be his military aide in the White House. Crucially, in conversations with me, Burris was careful to describe himself only as a subordinate in his relationship with Vice President Johnson. This fits with the example cited above, in which LBJ does the asking or ordering of Burris. However, when the curtain is pulled back, the opposite association between the two men becomes palpably apparent. Burris's true boss was not in the White House. His supervisor was in the Pentagon. He was behind a facade in which Johnson was in command of his job as the vice president. Burris was more of a case officer for Johnson than his so-called aide. Getting to the truth about Burris is akin to solving a buried mystery, like prying open an ancient crypt to discover the identity of a mummy. Howard Burris, the man who wore two hats. On 25 February 1961, LBJ finally sent out a press release saying that Colonel Burris was his Air Force aide and that occasionally he would also have people from various departments working with him on so-called other matters. Just 3 days later, on 1 March, Burris sent an extraordinary memo to LBJ titled Military Staff Personnel. Colonel Burris laid down the rules to the Vice President that would guide the two hats that he, Burris, would be wearing, as well as the more limited task-oriented rules that would guide other military officers working with or for LBJ. In the Pentagon, Burris wore his most significant hat. There, he could work with Army, Navy, and Air Force officers in office space set aside for his use in the Pentagon in room 4E 948, that's 4th floor, located directly above Defense Secretary McNamara's office on the 3rd floor in office 944. But, crucially, Burris's memo made clear that these other military officers were not to be included as aides to the Vice President. Only after many years did I discover, with the help of researcher Larry Happinen, the identity of the Air Force general in the Pentagon who was Burris's true boss. The wizard behind the curtain, Air Force Lieutenant General David A. BURCHINAL. BURCHINAL liked to tell LBJ about your instructions, when in fact Burris was the one making them. Burris described his new primary responsibility in this way. I shall continue daily intelligence studies, follow the formulation of NSC policies, keep informed of all Defense Department and JCS policies and programs, and devote special attention to the military space program. I shall be happy to assist or advise you in these particular areas or in any others which you suggest. The people working around LBJ soon came to understand that personally, Burris did not want so much responsibility. When LBJ became president, Burris did not want to be his aide. In interviews with me, Burris revealed he really didn't like LBJ. The person behind Burris in the Pentagon, the officer who wrote Burris's fitness reports, was Air Force Lieutenant General David A. BURCHINAL. BURCHINAL was very close to Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay. In fact, when LeMay was gone, BURCHINAL spoke for him, first at the Strategic Air Command and then at the Pentagon. Next up, Burris secretly told LBJ the truth about Viet Cong forces in Vietnam behind the backs of McNamara and JFK. Here is a slide that shows one of these back channel memos from Burris to the Vice President about what was going on with the Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can do that in your own time. This is just one of many of those memos. I like this one in particular because that's Burris's handwriting down there, where it shows that he's aware that Secretary of Defense McNamara is worried about what the hell's going on. He's still disturbed, as Burris says, and that he's leaving, McNamara's leaving today, March 20th, for meetings in Honolulu where he hopes to obtain some answers. Well, he got answers all right, but they weren't the truth. What was going on was a sudden reversal in reports on the military situation in South Vietnam. It happened in mid-February 1962, well before the new American advisors had arrived there, well before U.S. military reporting on the dire battlefield situation in Vietnam suddenly became optimistic. In late December 1961, the Joint Chiefs still argued that nothing short of several U.S. combat divisions could stave off defeat in Vietnam. Yet, shortly afterwards, 21 February 1962, the Central Intelligence Agency National Intelligence Estimate, NIE 1062, was still painting that same gloomy picture. And yet 3 days before that, on 19 February 1962, the third, we call them SECDEF conferences, they're the Secretary of Defense conferences, the third SECDEF conference that took place in Saigon, MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Commander General Harkins, had presented the new picture of optimism and growing confidence to Secretary of Defense McNamara there. But the truth was that the Viet Cong main force units in South Vietnam had doubled in size in the previous 6 months. And so there was a scramble to get people out there to figure out what the hell was going on. On 23 February 1962, for example, an officer, Bill Benedict, who was working in the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in Washington, he was ordered to proceed to Saigon to work on the Viet Cong order of battle. He had just come home to see his baby son, and out the door, he had to go, pursuant to what McNamara made happen. That conference, that SECDEF conference, undermined the sudden reversal in MACV reporting on the Viet Cong that was taking place by Harkins, the MACV commander, pictured there in the upper right-hand corner. McNamara was dubious, as you saw in that Burris memo, about the new optimistic reporting from MACV. It's interesting that the statistics genius, McNamara, he knew about the statistical surge in Viet Cong force levels. And at that conference, he waited for the MACV intelligence chief, Colonel James Winterbottom, a complete nincompoop, if you read my book, you'll see why. Anyway, he was on the dais, and the Secretary of Defense was waiting for him. He asked him about this new surge in Viet Cong forces. Well, Winterbottom didn't know what to do. He responded with a hedged prognosis and several graphs depicting an array of different figures on the size of the Viet Cong main forces, ranging from, say, 18,000 all the way up to almost 30,000. Lemster almost fell out of his seat. He was upset. He said, "Those figures make it look like we're losing." Well, why is that so? For those of you who don't understand very much about doctrine, especially counterinsurgency doctrine, counterinsurgency doctrine, going against these insurgents that are coming out of the woods, holds that a 10-to-1 ratio of friendly to enemy forces is crucial. So you're going to need 5 soldiers out of those 10 holding on to static defense areas, cities, POL, communications lines, and so on. And the rest, the other 5, would be available for going in the offense. And you have to have 6-to-1 ratio in order to avoid being wiped out. Anyway, that's the doctrine. Now look at the figure of the Winterbottom gave of 27,000. Well, that would require a South Vietnamese force of 270,000 armed men. Now, South Vietnamese forces are struggling to maintain 170,000 men. So McNamara's patience quickly ended. He was upset, and he ordered a specific statement of requirements to be taken back to Washington with him that very night. And he declared, this intelligence problem must be solved. And that's why Benedict was rushed back to MACV to help out in Saigon. So I'm going to summarize here about what is obviously a back channel, a secret back channel to the Vice President from Burris. The military command Vietnam's rosy accounts were the opposite of the bleak situation being reported by their own intelligence analysts to the analysts in the Pacific Theater, United States Army Pacific in Honolulu. Meanwhile, Secretary McNamara's reporting to Congress was still based on General Harkins' misleading statements. For example, in this 16 March 1962 report, that McNamara made to the House of Appropriations Committee said, quote, "I would say definitely we are approaching it from the point of trying to clean it up and terminating subversion, covert aggression, and combat operations." Well, at the same time, LBJ was in his office reading Burris's memos about how the United States was losing the war in Vietnam. So, here we have it. While LBJ was reading true accounts about the battlefield situation in South Vietnam, President Kennedy was reading false accounts. That dichotomy is one of the most significant enigmas of the Vietnam War during the Kennedy years. There is no getting around the incontrovertible proof that the truth about the failing war effort in South Vietnam was provided to Johnson through a privileged intelligence back channel. Moreover, the extant evidence clearly suggests that Johnson deliberately withheld this crucial national security information from President Kennedy. This slide set is only a beginning. A more detailed investigation and deep dive into this Vietnam deception will be handled in upcoming sections of this presentation. The defense intelligence analyst, George Allen, and other order of battle specialists would soon join up with Bill Benedict in a close examination of the Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam. All right, now I turn to the May 1961 vice presidential trip to South Vietnam. Burris recalled he had heard it on the radio that he was supposed to go, and he told Kennedy he wasn't going to go. But once LBJ arrived in South Vietnam, a plan unfolded to use LBJ to weaken President Kennedy's policy against combat troops in South Vietnam. Carl Rowan said LBJ had one of the biggest inferiority complexes I ever saw in a high-level official. So like it or not, LBJ was going to Saigon. Burris told me Johnson went out and just got stoned. He was so angry. He came back and slept on his couch. Finally, he let the Foreign Service officials in. One of them was the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, Carl Rowan. When the plane left, Burris gave Johnson the briefing book. LBJ looked at it for a second and said, "Howard, if you give me any more of this State Department crap again, I'll throw you off this plane." Rowan says LBJ was drinking a lot and verbally abused his staff in ways I found hard to believe. Yet when Johnson was sober, Rowan told me, he spoke with greater eloquence on the needs of poor nations and injustice in America than any individual I ever knew in my life. Johnson was full of conflict and contradiction, traits that would manifest themselves fully during his trip and in his report afterwards, and eventually to the misfortune of the country and the world during the course of the Vietnam War when he was the president. After the plane landed in Saigon on 11 May 1962, Johnson, along with Kennedy's sister Jean and brother-in-law Stephen Smith, proceeded to the official government guest house, Guy Long Palace, and then to a dinner hosted by U.S. Ambassador Nolting at the rooftop restaurant of Saigon's Caravel Hotel. The super secret cable from the Joint Chiefs to Lyndon Johnson. This section is a revised update of a 13-page account in Chapter 4 of my JFK in Vietnam 2017 edition. I'm including new material in this section because of its relevance to the developing intrigue surrounding General Lansdale and Colonel Burris during the Kennedy presidency. The most important activities that took place during Vice President Johnson's 1961 trip to South Vietnam appear in retrospect to have been a complicated, staged negotiation during the meetings between Lyndon Johnson and South Vietnamese President Ngo Diem on 12 May 1962. The signal event that precipitated that dark performance began after Johnson had retired to bed following the big banquet on the previous evening. Overnight, a top-secret cable had arrived in Saigon from the Joint Chiefs of Staff exclusively for LBJ. That cable discussed a Joint Chiefs recommendation to Secretary of Defense McNamara to send U.S. combat troops to South Vietnam. Johnson, after getting out of bed, had barely enough time to see it before his first meeting with DIEM. The gathering began at 8 a.m. on 12 May. Clearly, Johnson had to be told what to say to DIEM. Burris, who was on the trip, was the obvious candidate to pass on the cues to Lyndon Johnson. Let's go to the first meeting between Johnson and DIEM. During the morning session, Johnson avoided the subject of combat troops raised in the secret JCS cable. Instead, he discussed the points contained in a letter Kennedy had asked him to deliver to DIEM. Johnson handed it to DIEM, who sat down at his desk and read over it carefully. Johnson sat back and watched. The letter contained specific proposals for a joint effort by both countries to step up the campaign against the communists. It did not mention U.S. combat troops or a defense treaty. DIEM reacted by telling Johnson that he had trouble financing the 20,000-man increase in his army. DIEM added that reforms had to be appropriate to Vietnam, an underdeveloped country threatened by communist subversion. LBJ then committed the United States to providing helicopters and armored vehicles for the 20,000-man increase without asking DIEM to make any commitment to a local financing. Vice President Johnson surprised DIEM, telling him to send a letter of reply to JFK with a list of his urgent needs before LBJ's return back to Washington. That initial commitment went beyond President Kennedy's purpose for Lyndon Baines Johnson's trip there. So what was going on? Let's find out by looking at the second meeting that same day with President Ngo and DIEM. The foreplay ended at a no-holds-barred second round of talks that evening. Ambassador Nolting and General McGarr were both present for the fireworks. DIEM opened the discussion with an attack on the United States weak suit, Laos. He argued that Laos was being overrun by the communists because Kennedy was pursuing negotiations for neutralization. DIEM then laid down his hand. He said he needed an increase in his army of 120,000 men. That figure was well over its current level of 170,000 men. DIEM added that he couldn't afford to pay for the increase. Johnson responded by attacking DIEM's weak suit. Why couldn't 170,000 South Vietnamese soldiers deal with a Viet Cong force of just 10,000 soldiers? Which wasn't true. Then Johnson laid down his hand. How about introducing U.S. combat troops to do the job? DIEM replied he did not want U.S. troops to fight in his country, except in the case of overt aggression against South Vietnam. However, DIEM said he did want an increase in U.S. training personnel. The absence of acerbic discourse here in this staged duel stands out. So, what's going on? In all of these, in this staged situation, we can find the hidden hand of Edward Lansdale. What followed was far from a coincidence. General McGarr immediately asked DIEM if he would accept the introduction of U.S. combat troops for training purposes. With no argument or comment whatsoever, DIEM agreed. It appears DIEM knew beforehand how this part of the conversation would unfold. Crucially, this compromise on the combat troops issue was an exact match for Lansdale's insertion a few weeks earlier on 27 April into the Vietnam's task force report. If there was one person who knew how DIEM's mind worked and could provide a solution, it was Edward Lansdale. He'd been working with DIEM for years. DIEM and LBJ did not, by themselves, originate the idea of a further 120,000-man increase in the South Vietnamese army. Both men arrived at that figure by working it out with General McGarr sometime before Johnson arrived. In a second letter to Kennedy, DIEM confirmed that his figure had been worked out with General McGarr. Lansdale, who had worked closely with DIEM since the early 1950s, was angry with President Kennedy for not appointing him as the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, so he could be with his close friend DIEM. Burris, talking about something he calls the boys in the woodwork. The linchpin in the plan was the role of LBJ, and Burris knew it. He told me he recalled McGarr was saying that the troops were for training, but it was really just under the guise of training. The authors of the Pentagon Papers also point out that the training mission of these combat units was just a device to get DIEM to accept them. DIEM thought this was a concession desired by Washington, the price tag for the large increase in the South Vietnamese army he was asking the U.S. to pay for. It's intriguing that Burris was instructed by persons he calls the boys in the woodwork not to discuss the combat troops issue with his putative boss, Lyndon Johnson. I asked Burris why he was told this. He replied, because DIEM was a marked man and someone who should not be dealt with on that issue. That dark remark is disturbing. It strongly suggests that someone rehearsed Burris during the trip to South Vietnam with Johnson. Who is giving orders to the Vice President's military aid, and why? The answer is that many U.S. leaders wanted U.S. combat troops sent to Vietnam and DIEM out of the way. So the question hanging in the air is, who were the boys in the woodwork? When I pressed Burris to tell me who the boys in the woodwork were, he answered evasively, you ought to know. You're one of them. But that would suggest military officers. That's what I was. He gave away some of the answers in a later interview while complaining to me about Director of Central Intelligence John McCone. And here's what he said. McCone was Undersecretary of the Air Force when I was assistant to Air Force Secretary Finletter, and McCone was a real bastard then, just as he was when he was at the CIA. I used to get stuff from the boys so I could get the background together before the meetings in the White House, but McCone didn't like that. Well, let's put this together here. It's not a question of which component, the Pentagon or the CIA, the boys in the woodwork are. It was not either or. It was, and it still is, a question of both and, in which the military has the upper hand. For previous analyses on the arcane activities of this May 1961 trip, see JFK in Vietnam, 2nd edition, pages 71 to 83. Let's summarize this LBJ play for combat troops in Vietnam. One of Kennedy's goals for the LBJ trip to Saigon was to bolster DIEM's confidence and reassure him of American support. Nothing to do with combat troops. Johnson's comments to the press and his antics in the streets and his buttering up of DIEM at the banquet more than fulfilled this part of the mission that JFK sent him there to perform. But concealed behind Johnson's ebullient behavior lay a well-coordinated and audacious plan to guide the vice president at each moment during that visit so that he could carry out the suggestion contained in the top-secret cable from the Joint Chiefs of Staff for combat troops. If Colonel Howard Burris was the coach calling in the plays during the May 1961 vice presidential trip to Vietnam, who was giving the plays to Burris? The previous slide provided the answer to that for 1961. Slide set B2 earlier provided the same answer for the order of battle deception in 1962. Slide set B4, which is coming next, will examine how this had become the case for everything during the presidency of John Kennedy. The declassified files of Howard Leigh Burris, the 1,000 days back channel, Over 700 up-to-date accurate reports on important worldwide events sent daily, eyes only, from Howard Burris to Vice President Lyndon Johnson. The final stop at the LBJ Library. On 19 May 2021, I rose from bed early to get to Dulles Airport in time to board United Airlines 2017 for Austin, Texas. There I'd meet up with Heather Tarver-Fear, a research associate whose uncanny luck turned whatever she turned into gold. After 19 years of research and writing about Howard Leigh Burris, it was finally time to visit the Fountainhead, the vice presidential file at the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library in Austin, Texas. Heather joined me for 3 long days there, after which I returned to Harrisonburg, Virginia. Minutes after I walked into the house, I couldn't wait to begin processing the more than 170 documents that we had copied at the LBJ Library. It was a good thing I'd visited that narrow archive loaded for bear. I actually had hair when I began investigating Burris way back when. I'd carried the data and files described previously in this segment, in section 3, slides B2 and 3, with me to Austin. However, this slide set provides a much wider and unexpected context for what I had learned from Burris about the 1962 Vietnam Order of Battle Deception and the May 1961 vice presidential trip to South Vietnam. Those 2 events were examples of when Burris had been a secret back channel of information to the vice president. Often as we worked at the library in Austin, Heather kept repeating the question, "Are you seeing this?" All I could say was, "Yes, it's unbelievable." What I brought home to Harrisonburg was not one-off back channel briefings. The Burris back channel to LBJ began on day 1 and it never stopped. An unbroken chain of true information was flowing to LBJ, while the information flowing to JFK was only what government agencies wanted to know about. The reason for such an amazingly comprehensive preparation of the vice president hung in the air all the way back to Harrisonburg, Virginia. Johnson's presidency cannot be understood apart from his vice presidency. One thing I learned later about Vice President Johnson was that he seemed to have a sense that President Kennedy's life would come to an end, and that he feared it might lead to a nuclear war. In the fall of 1963, during the debate over what to do about DIEM, Johnson made this revealing comment. LBJ said he had never been sympathetic with our proposal to produce a change of government in Vietnam by means of plotting with Vietnamese generals. Now that the generals had failed to organize a coup, he thought we ought to reestablish ties with the DIEM government as quickly as possible and get forward with the war against the Viet Cong. The Burris memos we brought back from the LBJ Library opened up the way for considering that all along, one of his tasks, whether he liked it or not, for Burris, was to prepare Lyndon Baines Johnson to take over the Oval Office. The problem was how to keep LBJ from making mistakes. A big problem was LBJ's drinking. It called into question his longevity, let alone his ability to keep secrets. Think about this. On the Air Force One flight back to Washington after the assassination, Johnson was caught staring out a window, and he said to a subordinate, "I wonder if the missiles are flying." I'll let you think about that. From the beginning, Burris was in charge of LBJ, not the reverse. In February 1961, Burris did not wait for Vice President Johnson to announce his decision about Burris's title and duties. 2 weeks before LBJ let the press know that Burris would become one of his aides, the Air Force intelligence colonel had already penetrated deep inside the most sensitive area of the National Security Council. The national security apparatus of the Eisenhower years had been stood down and was in flux at the time. Bromley Smith remained as the executive secretary of the National Security Council during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and he worked hand in glove with President Kennedy's national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy. From the get-go, Bromley Smith was a key link for Colonel Burris's handling of the vice president. Burris immediately zeroed in on the opportunity to take advantage of that inside track. Bromley was one of many senior officers from the Eisenhower years willing to play inside ball with Burris. And so, given Johnson's proclivities, Burris settled in for a long, bumpy ride with Johnson. Burris was quick on the draw. So before Vice President Johnson had a chance to tell Burris what his functions in the national security apparatus would be, Howard Burris told LBJ what his principal functions would be. As Burris explained to LBJ, one of the principal functions which the military aide or a member of his staff would normally perform is briefing you on agenda items for the National Security Council meetings. Last week, Mr. Bundy briefed you, but the extent, complexities, and priorities of his duties with the president might preclude your reliance upon him in the future to any appreciable degree. On 25 February 1961, LBJ finally sent out a press release saying that Colonel Burris was his, quote, Air Force aide, unquote. 3 days later, Burris told LBJ he had two hats, an aide to LBJ and a nominal Air Force assignment in the Pentagon. As it turns out, it was far more than nominal. Burris was firmly wired in to the heart of the daily National Security Council system. Burris noted that he was already being furnished lists of the national security agenda items, but he also revealed the background and ramifications of each item are available only from the NSC Planning Board, where all decisions are discussed and put into final form for presentation to the President. In an oral history interview, Bromley Smith was asked if he used a liaison person to furnish Planning Board papers, final drafts, and views of different agencies to Burris. Smith replied that no, he met personally with Burris, never less than once a week and always before every National Security Council meeting, to let Burris decide how it all fit best into Johnson's staff system. Bundy was busy organizing meetings and seeing that the decisions were made that were reported back to all departments. JFK was only told part of what he needed to know. Burris was free to tell LBJ everything that he needed to know. From the beginning, Howard Burris was in the catbird seat. So Burris had to explain to LBJ just how much time he wanted on LBJ's calendar. As the Cold War heated up in the fall of 1961, Burris was tightening the reins of control over the vice president. On 15 September 1961, Burris sent this alarming proposal to Lyndon Johnson. The many urgent and sometimes grave issues facing the United States in the political, military, or national security field suggest frequent discussions are necessary with me in order to keep you informed of these rapidly developing situations. I mean continuous daily contact. I maintain continuous daily contact with state, defense, CIA, and the NSC professional staff. Additionally, I maintain periodic liaison with other agencies and departments of government. Although the volume of information is immense, even when the subjects are boiled down to their essential elements, I believe that briefings for you 3 times each week will be adequate for your purposes. Burris said special presentations on urgent matters might be necessary and suggested that the briefing should be conducted every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Well, with the Bay of Pigs trauma still present and Vietnam still unresolved, there was a nuclear tinge crisis looming over Berlin. So there was a lot going on, to be sure. But all LBJ had in mind was a quick talk in the elevator ride down in the morning. But Burris wasn't finished explaining even more rules to Lyndon Johnson. Burris said, "May I suggest to you that you assign to me the initiative of establishing with your secretary on each of those days an appointment which can be accommodated to that particular day's schedule. I propose to devote the opening portion of each briefing to current and essential information on intelligence, defense, and state matters, and State Department matters." Burris then identified Vietnam and Berlin as the particularly special subjects. With this access to the Vice President's daily schedule, Burris was able to shape Lyndon Johnson's awareness of all political, military, and national security affairs goings on. With some irritation, LBJ reluctantly agreed to Burris's plan. Here's what he told Burris: "Howard, the easiest time for me is for you to come down in the elevator with me in the morning. Once I get here, the phone is so busy it would be difficult. But if you want to do it this way, all right." At the start of 1961, LBJ was oblivious to why Burris required so much of his time. By the summer of 1963, that would change. I would submit we cannot overlook the role of General LeMay and General BURCHINAL in Burris's care and feeding of LBJ. And so we'll get into an interesting example of that. At the end of 1961, an Air Force Major Cross was a pilot for the Air Force who was selected to take the Vice President on his first Jetstar trip. The problem was that LBJ wanted to use the airstrip at his ranch. It was a 5,000-foot runway, pretty short, that ran sharply uphill, and the Air Force was vehemently opposed to Cross even taking the Jetstar into that ranch. Lyndon used his military aide, Colonel Burris, to put pressure on the Air Force to drop their objections. So Major Cross and Colonel Burris went to the ranch and made some successful landings anyway to prove their point. Then Major Cross told his commanding officer, who was responsible for the rules on these things, his name was Colonel Ireland, that they could do it. Ireland told Cross to tell Burris and LBJ not to do it. But LBJ was impervious. He asked Cross if it was safe, and when the answer was yes, LBJ said, "Well, let's go do it. By God, we'll call General LeMay, or call whoever we have to." Afraid to call Air Force Chief of Staff LeMay, Cross decided to make the trip anyway, and everything went just fine. So, interesting story here we've got with General LeMay, Colonel Burris, and Major Cross, and of course Lyndon Johnson. Now, the Jetstar was originally a Lockheed project for the United States Air Force. Maximum cruising speed, Mach 0.8, had a range of 2,500 miles. It had interior seating for 8 and included a full-size lavatory. The Jetstar was one of the first in its class to allow a person to walk upright in the cabin. The Air Force later dropped the aircraft due to budget cuts. Well, a month and a half later, during January 1962, the Vice President called Cross and said that President Kennedy wanted Cross to take LBJ to Grand Turk Island. Cross was to pick up John Glenn after he landed from the first U.S. orbital space flight, bring Glenn back to Cape Canaveral for a big ceremony, and then take LBJ back to Washington. LBJ insisted he would be going in his new Jetstar. Cross made the arrangements, and the time arrived for the departure. When Cross looked out the window at 7 p.m., he said, quote, "The fog was so thick you could just cut it with a knife, and it was dropping down all over the eastern seaboard." 0-0. Cross called LBJ with the bad news. The Air Force prohibits us from taking off in anything under a half-mile visibility. At the time, it was 0-0, meaning zero ceiling and zero visibility. Lyndon asked Cross if he could make it in the zero takeoff. In an oral history, Cross replied what happened. He said, "I said I could make it, Mr. Vice President, but the Air Force won't let me." LBJ said, "God damn it, LeMay told me that I could have anything I want. I don't know why the hell it is that every time I want to do something, you and all them damn colonels and all them damn generals over there, by God, they won't let me have anything I want. By God, you just pick up that phone and call General LeMay and tell him that I said I want to go, and that he should permit you to make this takeoff." Major Cross felt it wasn't his place to do that. So he called his wing commander again, Colonel Ireland, and said LBJ had told him to call General LeMay. Ireland ordered, "No, by God, you can't go." Well, LBJ and Cross had the last laugh. When Major Cross pleaded he did not want to defy the vice president, Ireland would not budge. "Well, by God, you can't go. We've got rules." Cross asked Colonel Burris for help. Burris told Cross to call General LeMay, and this time he did. LeMay said, "Well, I don't see any problem. Can you make it?" Cross said, "Yes, sir." And LeMay said, "Well, just do it." LBJ said, "Well, we're going if you think you can make it." And I said, "Yes, sir, I think we can make it." And LBJ said, "All right, we're going to get ourselves ready and come on." Burris, commander, Colonel Ireland, was forced to use his Ford station wagon to lead Major Cross down the taxiway through the fog. As Cross recalled, "We got cleared for takeoff, and so we took off. Didn't have a bit of trouble. We got to Grand Turk, picked up John Glenn, and we came back right on schedule to Cape Canaveral." Cross would never forget Lyndon Johnson's declaration. "By God, LeMay's always told me I can have anything I want, and now you're telling me I can't. By God, you just call LeMay and call his hand." In summary, what are we to take away from this segment? Well, besides what Burris called his perplexing status, managing the vice president, Burris found the best way to carry out his duties and ensure LeMay and BURCHINAL knew this: LBJ was prepared to assume the duties of the president.